Hi everyone, it's me coming back to you for our Southeast Asia lecture. Um, I'm coming to you from my daughter's room, and there's actually pictures of me in Southeast Asia behind me, so it's cool. All right, I need to share this screen. How do I do that? Sorry, I should have done this before. Oh, all right. We are talking Southeast Asia today. And next week, we're going to talk East Asia. East Asia is a pretty big region because we want to go over China, we want to go over Japan, and the two Koreas, North and South Korea. So I'm going to split next week's lecture into two different parts, focusing on probably China on its own, and then the two Koreas and Japan in a different lecture. I have a couple videos posted that go with this lecture on Southeast Asia today, but not that many. I have one on, it's called Mr. Condom. It's a TED Talk, and it's about this person who introduced a very innovative way of dealing with population growth through advocating, like strong advocating for birth control in the 1970s. And then I have like a short National Geographic video about Angkor Wat, which is a place we're going to talk about today. And I think that's it for Southeast Asia videos, but I'm going to have a bunch of videos that go along with the East Asia because there's a lot for us to understand in Japan, in China. And John Oliver has done a couple of really good pieces on China, on China's president, on the one-child policy, and then on North Korea. We want to understand North Korea because it's one of the places in the world that is not very well understood. It's closed off, and yeah. So you're also reading a book on North Korea. It's this book. If you don't have this book, or if you're unaware that you're supposed to read this book because you have a quiz on April 23rd, well, think about that now because shipping and getting books right now is pretty difficult. So think about that. After East Asia, we're going to go into the South Pacific, talk about Hawaii and New Zealand, and then we're going to move into Australia, and then that's it. Yeah, and then you have your final, and I'm thinking for your final doing multiple choice. If you will all let me know how you feel about doing multiple choice, send me an email. but yeah, that's what I'm thinking for the final. Okay, so Southeast Asia, I have two quotes for you. Frederick Douglass, who is not Southeast Asian, but is a good quote for right now. If there's no struggle, then there's no progress. And then this is one of my favorite quotes to keep in my head when I'm trying to think like, oh, how can I be doing enough? How can I make sure that I'm balancing my life with the things that I want to do and the things that I want to make sure I include in my everyday life? So I keep that in mind, which is do all the good you can by all the means you can in all the ways you can in all the places you can at all the times you can as long as you ever can. I think if you're always doing those things, then you're probably doing pretty well in life. Okay, so Southeast Asia, where is this region? Now, I've been moving my face around on screen, but I don't think it's actually moving around with your recording. I think I might always be in the top corner. So Southeast Asia can be broken down into two different parts. So Indochina is this part. Indochina is Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. These parts of Southeast Asia down here that are mostly islands or broken up countries that are broken up across islands. And then Southeast Asia or Indochina, and you might have heard that term if you've ever read anything or watched anything on Vietnam, on the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was often referred to, people who were going to Vietnam, it was often referred to as Indochina because if you know anything about the Vietnam War, it didn't just take place in Vietnam, it also spread into this country down here, Cambodia, and then Laos, which is this skinny country right here. So we break these two apart, and I'm going to talk about the economy and the environment of Indonesia and Malaysia. And then I'm going to talk about the economy and the environment of the whole general area, but I'm also going to focus on some things that happened in Indochina, and we're going to talk about the religion of the area. There's a lot of different religions, but the dominant religion in Indochina, at least this part, is Buddhism. And then if we come down to Indonesia, Indonesia is the most densely populated Islamic country in the world. So Indonesia is an Islamic country. And if you remember me saying from last week when I talked about South Asia, and then when I talked about Southwest Asia, that it probably got here from trade. People probably came from Southwest Asia on boats, made their way down into Indonesia and spread Islam that way. This is our most densely populated Islamic country in the world, with the exception of one little island. If you know the island of Bali, the island of Bali is an Indonesian island and it is Hindu. It's part of the country of Indonesia, but the island is primarily Hindu. And then we have other religions through here, but we're looking at Buddhism and we're looking at Islam because we've already spent a good amount of time understanding Islam. I'm going to spend a little bit of time so that we know Buddhism. Not just because it's interesting to understand Buddhism, but also it plays a major role in this region. So this region is, if we were to look at the amount of space that it takes up, it's actually bigger than the contiguous United States. Contiguous means like all the parts of the US that are touching each other, so not Hawaii and not Alaska. But as you can see, it's mostly water. So if we were to take the contiguous US and lay them like right on top of Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia would actually be bigger, just to give you an idea of how much space this takes up. But like I said, there is mostly water in between. Okay. So when we're looking at the physiography, the physical geography of Southeast Asia, first of all, we have what's called the Indonesian archipelago. So an archipelago, if you're not sure what that means, or if you don't remember from when we talked about the Caribbean, an archipelago is a collection of islands. And as you can see, we have the Indonesian collection of islands right here. This is Indonesia, this southern part. This northern part is Malaysia. It's a very volcanic active area. So once again, when we talk about this physical geography, pretty much any time you're going to have a physical geography that incorporates a lot of islands, it's going to be an area where you have a lot of geologic activity. So you're going to have earthquakes, you're going to have, this is part of what we call the Pacific Ring of Fire. So the Pacific Ring of Fire is we have the Pacific Plate. And the Pacific Plate is this gigantic tectonic plate that borders us here in California, right out there, and goes like right through Japan and comes down here through Southeast Asia. So that Ring of Fire, and if we were in class, I would show you a map actually. Let me show you a map over here. Move. That's my face, but I don't just have my face on my computer screen. It's a picture of me and my daughter. Okay, so our Pacific Ring of Fire, this is a map of Asia again, but it runs right along through here. So it comes down through Japan, comes in right through Indonesia, goes down into the South Pacific, and then comes back along I guess that would be the the eastern side of the South Pacific, and then the eastern side of the North Pacific. And it is moving in this direction. If you can see the little cross, it's moving up. It's basically like pushing up into Russia and into Japan. So this is going to be very, very active tectonic region. Japan is the most earthquake-prone country in the world. It's not uncommon there to have like little earthquakes in the morning. You wake up and you have like you wake up to a little earthquake. So if you can imagine for Indonesia and for the rest of Southeast Asia, we're looking at a region that has a lot of volcanic activity as a result of being on the Pacific Ring of Fire, a lot of earthquakes, and all the things that are going to come with that. So just like in the Caribbean, when we talked about how in the Caribbean, you basically have these 4 different plates that are converging and pushing into the Caribbean, causing all kinds of earthquakes, causing all kinds of volcanic eruptions and stuff like that. But then you also have Hurricane Alley. So you have hurricanes coming through that region. And what happens when you have a steep slope and you have a volcanic activity, or you have an earthquake, and then you get hit with a hurricane? What's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of debris flow and a lot of landslides. Same thing in this region. Same thing in this region. So this region, just like the Caribbean, is a place where you have very active tectonic activity. Plus, this is another area in the world where they get a lot of hurricanes. They don't call them hurricanes. They call them typhoons, but they're the same cyclonic storm. That a cyclonic storm is one that's, right, it's a cyclone that circles around, and it happens in the South Pacific, or sorry, it happens in the low latitudes as a result of intense humidity and an intense surplus of the sun's energy. And yeah, if you are interested in learning more about hurricanes, weather and climate, physical geography, we go over hurricanes a lot. Hurricanes have a purpose. The purpose, they're very destructive to us, but their purpose is to basically take the excess heat that's around the equator and throw it, like literally, like the hurricanes come around and they take this excess heat and they disperse it to northern and southern latitudes that don't get nearly as much energy, nearly as much of the sun's energy or the sun's heat. So when we look at this area, it's going to have a lot of the same issues physical geography wise as the Caribbean had, which is tectonic activity, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, debris flow, landslides. And if you remember back to the Caribbean, that is a place that wasn't very economically stable. And if you remember, I argued that one of the main reasons that it's not economically stable is because its physical geography is so severe. So when we look at this region, it's really no different physical geography wise from the Caribbean. I mean, there's differences. Of course, there's differences. There's a lot more limestone in this part of the world. Limestone is a type of rock that is very vulnerable to carbonic acid. So what happens when water like rains down, the soil stores a whole lot of carbon. So when water like makes its way through carbon, it absorbs that carbon. It makes it this like slightly acidic water. And if what's underneath that soil is limestone, that carbonic acid is going to run along that limestone and break it down. And it creates what we call a karst landscape. And that karst landscape just basically like digs gigantic holes into the earth, if that makes sense. And all through like Vietnam, especially, but in this region, there is a whole lot of limestone. So there is a lot of these underground caverns. And so you can have underground caverns. I think we talked about that in Mexico when we talked about the Caribbean, excuse me, and the Maya and how the Maya survived, or they were able to flourish and build their civilization because of these huge underground caverns that were a result of limestone that stored all of this fresh water. The other thing that can happen with a karst landscape is, just imagine if what your land is based on is limestone, and that limestone is carved away from the slightly acidic carbonic acid that's running over it. What you're going to have is a gigantic hole. So what happens with that big hole is the whole land drops, right? Like it doesn't have anything supporting it eventually, and it just drops. And when it drops, you have these really dramatic hills. Let me just look it up really fast. So I can show you a picture. Ah, that's your syllabus. See, it's just like we're in class. Ooh, look at that. So this is what I'm talking about, how the landscape will literally fall. If you can see this picture. So imagine, so this is all going to be limestone. And imagine that once upon a time, this was the land was all up here. This was like a flat land, and then the karst landscape, the limestone that this land is based on, was so thoroughly carved out that the land just like fell down, leaving these large, sometimes phallic looking pieces of the landscape. Okay, so you're going to see a physical geography that looks like that as well. It's very humid. This is another place that you're going to have a lot of monsoons. I don't know if anybody has been to Southeast Asia, but it is very humid. Yeah, I was there when I was 24. I was there for March and April of one year, and that's March and April, right? That's spring, and it was so freaking hot. And talk about a schwitz. Oh, a schwitz. By the way, it's Passover. Happy Passover. If anybody, I don't remember if there's any other Jewish people in the class, but Passover is one of my favorite holidays. It commemorates the moving of the Jews out of Egypt, and the escaping of the Jews out of Egypt led by Moses. And it's one of my favorite holidays because all of us have been emancipated from something, right? Whether it's emancipated from some sort of mental slavery or from any kind of a negative relationship with a family member, with a loved one, with a friend. Like we all have a story of escape. So I like Passover because I like thinking about that story of escape or multiple stories of escape we might all have, and remembering the strength that you had when you emancipated yourself. So think about that. I remembered that it was Passover because I said schwitz. All right. So just like South Asia, we talked about last week with the monsoons, if you remember, that means reversal of wind, and it's a result of the very short, very hot summers in Russia, and how those very hot, very short summers in Russia lead to a low pressure system in Russia. So the air rises, and when air rises, what happens is it has mass, so other air has to come in and fill that space. And when that air rises and other air comes in to fill the space, what we have is the air that's normally making its way out. So here's Asia again. Normally we have air that is making its way out of Russia. It's in Russia, it's cold, it's sinking, it hits the surface of the earth, and then it gets pulled down here because it's normally warm, and there's normally a low pressure system that is leading to this air rising. So it's a vacuum, so this air is getting pulled out. But in the very, very short, very, very hot summers, there is a reversal of that wind that leads to the humid, warm air that is sitting over the Indian Ocean and then over here over the South Pacific, and that gets pulled into Russia and it hits the mountains. And if you look at this part of Asia, you have the Himalayas that are affecting India, but the Himalayas are also affecting Southeast Asia. So not to mention, this is, like I said, an area with a lot of tectonic activity. And because of that tectonic activity, you're going to have all kinds of orographic lifting, where the warm, densely humid air that is normally sitting over this ocean is going to make its way up and over the mountains all through Southeast Asia, and then eventually up through the Himalayas, and it's going to condense and dump all that rain. So you have monsoons in this region. In fact, if you've been to this region and been to the countryside, you probably have noticed that houses are built up on stilts. And in the Burma book that you read last week, he notes that how houses in the area that are conducive to the physical geography are built up on stilts that allows air to circulate underneath, keeping the house cool. And then in the rainy season, in the monsoon season, it means that you're not going to flood. And so if we were to live in Vietnam, or we were to live in Thailand or in Cambodia, we would probably have two different types of transportation: a motor scooter or a bike, and a boat. So depending on the time of the year, your streets are so flooded that you need a boat to get around, or you have your bicycle or your motor scooter or a tuk-tuk. Has anybody been on a tuk-tuk? Let me know if you've been on a tuk-tuk. All right. So we have our area, like I said, that's larger than the continental, or the word I used was contiguous US, but most of it's ocean. You have a lot of regions, or sorry, a lot of peninsulas and a lot of islands. So we talked about the islands, but if you remember what a peninsula is, it's a piece of land that's covered, that's surrounded by 3 sides of water, right? And if you remember, that was a great thing for Europe. Europe is basically a whole bunch of peninsulas. It's great because it's very, very good for trade. But this part of the world, Southeast Asia, is a place that we refer to as a shatter belt. A shatter belt. So a shatter belt is when you have an area that is highly accessible by water, just like Southeast Asia. So where is my arrow? There it is. You have an area that's highly accessible by water and that has access to a much larger population. As a result, a shatter belt is generally a place that people want to control. Southwest Asia was similar in that it had access to water, like the Mediterranean, and then it had access to a much larger population. Again, being East Asia or Europe, and then of course Africa traded on the Silk Road as well. But a shatter belt is a place that's easily accessible by water for trade, easily accessible to like larger populations, larger political powers. And as a result, people always want to control it. And that's exactly what the history of this area has been, that because it's a shatter belt, because it's a peninsula, because it has much larger civilizations right next to it, people have always tried to control it. And so we're going to talk about the Vietnam War in just a minute, but the Vietnam War is just one in a very long series of people coming in and attempting to control this area because of its good location and because of its resources. And then we have something called the Wallace Line that I'm going to go over in just a minute. It's an irregular shape because of, like I said, that karst landscape, and because of volcanic activity. You have these deep gorges, you have very wide valleys, but you have like these, it's dotted with like these really extreme, really extreme relief, so really steep hills. And we're in the tropics here, so you have a very acidic soil. Basically, soil is a balance, and it's a balance between the parent material, which is eroded rock, and biomass, which is us and plants and everything that decompose into the soil. Now, if you're in like a dry area, you're going to have more parent material, right? Because there's going to be more rock eroding and less things that can live in that environment. But in the tropics, we have a whole lot of water because of, it's very humid. You have a lot of condensation and precipitation, but you also have a whole lot of the sun's energy because you're right in the tropics. So the sun is just focused on you. Because remember, the sun only goes up to 23.5 degrees north and down to 23.5 degrees south all year long. Its energy is always focused somewhere in there. So because of that good sun energy, basically, that's like plant food, and because of all of the good water, there's way more biomass. Just like in Africa, when we talked about like the core of Africa, and just like in the Amazon rainforest, so the Congo rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, this is our other big rainforest in the world. Indonesia especially is our other big rainforest in the world, and it's because it's in that rainforest region. It's in that region where you have a surplus of the sun's energy, a whole lot of water, so you have a lot of living things. As a result, you're going to have a soil that has more biomass than parent material. So remember, in a dry area, we're going to have more parent material, less biomass, but in this area, we're going to have more biomass, less parent material, which means that your soil is going to be pretty acidic. So the plants throughout the tropics have adapted to a very acidic soil. Coffee, for example, likes that acidic soil. Bananas, oranges, anything that you can imagine that is a tropical plant, sugar, cacao, they all love the acidic soil. So this is the Wallace line. So the Wallace line, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a biogeographic term, and it has to do with, and look at the name Wallace is obviously a colonizer's name. Just like when we get to Australia, which is down here, we're going to learn a whole lot about colonizers' names versus Aboriginal names. We're going to see it not so much in New Zealand because of the history of New Zealand. We're going to see it in Hawaii, and of course we saw it in Africa. So the Wallace line is a biogeographic line. And if you don't remember what biogeographic means, it means the study of the spatial dispersion of plants and animals. So if you're a geographer and you want to study biology, you would be a biogeographer, somebody who studies the spatial distribution of plants and animals. And what we see in this imaginary line, there's not a real like red line that's drawn in the middle of the earth right here. We see a distinct variation in plants and animals. So if you imagine above this line, you're going to get the kinds of plants and animals that you might associate with Southeast Asia: monkeys, orangutans, dense tropical forest with like gigantic, elephant ear leaves, elephants. Southeast Asia and South Asia have Asian elephants, which are like little versions. I mean, they're not little, they're elephants still, but the big elephant is the African elephant. And then an Asian elephant is a smaller version, but it's still an elephant, it's still gigantic. And so when we go south of the Wallace line, what we start to see are plants and animals that you might associate with Australia. And so when we talk about Australia, we're going to talk about all the plants and animals there and how freaking funky they are. But just think about your marsupials, your monotremes. If you don't know what that means, you will. Like the platypus, like the echidna, like the wombat, and all the deadly snakes. In fact, this area in general, above and below the Wallace line, has the most deadliest snakes in the world. So the deadliest snake in the world is a Malaysian snake. And then the second deadliest snake in the world is an Australian snake called the brown snake. That's something about Australia. When we get there, we'll talk about how they just call things like they are. You got a big pink lake in Australia. Its name is Pink Lake. You have the dividing range of Australia. The mountains look kind of blue, so they're called the Blue Mountains. And you have a brown snake that's the second deadliest snake in the world. And what do you call it? The brown snake. Call it like it is. So the Wallace line is that division between those animals that you would associate with like Malaysia, Indonesia, the monkeys, the orangutans, the tropical leaves, the dense rainforest. And then below the Wallace line are the things that you might associate with Australia. Think about the types of trees. If you haven't seen Australian trees, should have pictures of Australian plants. I have them in my house, but like the bottle brush, for example, if you know what the bottle brush is, it's this red. Here's look up. So you know what I'm talking about. There you go. Have you ever seen that before? I'm gonna get a tattoo of a bottle brush on my back. Maybe here. We'll see. All right, so that is what we're going to see south of the Wallace line, plants that look more like that. And we'll get into that more when we talk about Australia. Okay, so that's what the Wallace line. It's the biogeographic division between the tropics that you would see in Southeast Asia and the individual flair of Australia. That's what we'll call it when it comes to nature. Now, this is a region that produces a lot of rice. If you know anything about rice, 60% of the world's population eats rice on a daily basis. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is, if you remember, I said that there are more people that live inside this circle than outside this circle. And guess what grows inside this circle? It's rice. Rice likes it very, very wet and very hot. That's where rice likes to grow, where it is very wet and very hot. So Southeast Asia is where it grows, and people eat a lot of rice in Southeast Asia as well as East Asia as well as South Asia, but we also eat rice all around the world. So the production of rice in Southeast Asia is going to feed 60% of the world, basically. China is the #1 exporter of rice. The second biggest exporter of rice in the world is Vietnam. So the way that they grow their rice in Vietnam and in China, because so many people in the world eat it, it's going to have a very big effect on us, whether we eat it or not. Does that make sense? So the way that you grow rice in those two countries, China and Vietnam, because 60% of the world's population is eating rice on a daily basis, how they grow rice there is going to have a very big impact on the world, whether you eat rice or not. So remember I said that this was a very mountainous region, and this very mountainous region is a place where we grow rice. And what happens, like when you're on a slope like this, because a lot of this region is going to be high relief, it's going to be slopes, is you have thinner topsoil as a result of that, right? And it's really hard to grow things just like straight up on a hill. So what we do, and we saw this in the Andes as well, is we tier into a mountain. So we have a mountain, and basically we have like a mountain. See, you can't see that. And we create little steps in the mountain so that it looks like that. You see that? What the hell does that even look like? So you take something that's a steep slope and you create little steps in it. And then now we have all these flat spaces that we can grow on. And as you can see, what's happening with these steps is we have rice paddies. So this is a mountain that has been cut into steps that is growing rice. And this is in Vietnam. This is another one. Why didn't I just bring up that picture instead of trying to draw this? So once again, we take this like nice steep slope and we cut steps into it and we grow on those steps. Okay, so that's one thing that we want to know about rice production. Another thing we want to know about rice production is, first, remember, we have a lot of people who eat rice in the world, 7.7 billion, 60% of 7.7 billion eat rice every day. And so you have a lot of people who are making the choice between tropical rainforest and rice paddies. So one big part of growing rice is it's led to deforestation in Southeast Asia. It's not the only thing that's led to deforestation, but it is a major cause of deforestation. And then the way that we grow rice is by something called wet rice farming. So wet rice farming right here, which is where you flood the fields. Remember, rice likes it really, really wet, and rice can actually grow completely submerged in water. And this is good because you have a lot of water in this region. I mean, we never have enough water in the world, but you do have a lot of water, so you can flood the rice paddies. And this is good because it cuts down on herbicides and pesticides, right? Like if you have weeds that are trying to grow and choke out the rice paddy, if you have different pests that are coming to eat the rice, if we just soak it in water, those weeds can't grow, those pests can't get in there. So that's good because it doesn't require the type of fertilizers, especially synthetic fertilizers, and the type of synthetic herbicides that we use here in the US on our corn. And that for those synthetic fertilizers, those synthetic herbicides, they require, I'm sorry, not fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, synthetic herbicides, they require a whole lot of oil for their production, and they get into our soil and then they get into the Mississippi drainage basin, like we talked about when we were in North America, and they make their way into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's very, very destructive. So you don't have to do that, but, and here's the big but, it's a breeding ground for bacteria. So what happens in these rice paddies is bacteria just love it, right? Bacteria are just like swimming around, you know, they're having like gigantic orgies, and so they're just constantly breeding and they're farting. Really, the bacteria are just farting, and that farting leads to methane. So while we don't have the same sort of, while we don't have the same excess fertilizers and excess excess pesticides and excess herbicides that have this adverse effect here in North America, we do have a lot of methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas. So greenhouse gas, if you don't remember, there's three greenhouse gases. Those are gases in our atmosphere that vary in amount. There's fixed gases in our atmosphere, like oxygen. Our atmosphere is always about 21% oxygen. Okay, so it's always about the same. But a variable gas is one that sometimes there's more of, sometimes there's less of. And our three variable greenhouse gases, those are the ones that sometimes there's more of, sometimes there's less of. And those gases absorb heat. They're just like little sponges for heat. That's carbon dioxide, that's methane, and that's water vapor. So when we're producing methane from bacteria farting in our rice fields, it actually has 23 times the concentration of carbon dioxide. So it's a greenhouse gas, but it absorbs 23 times what carbon dioxide absorbs, making it like a really powerful little heat sponge. And 20% of the methane worldwide is produced in these rice paddies. So that's an issue. Okay, now let's talk about religion for a minute. Like I said, Indonesia is the most densely populated Islamic country in the world. And we know about Islam. We know about the 5 pillars. We know about the tenets of Islam. We know where Islam comes from, Muhammad and the Quran, and all the stuff that we talked about with Islam. We know that Islam is a Abrahamic religion. But the other religion that we see in this region is a lot of Buddhism. So looking at this region now, the Philippines, they're Catholic. They were colonized by the Spanish, so you still have a lot of Roman Catholicism, but you also have a good concentration of Islamic people. You have a population of Islamic people in the Philippines as well. In Indonesia, like I said, it is very Islamic, Malaysia as well, but then you have little pockets of Hinduism. So here is Bali. This is the island of Bali that I said was Hindu. We've got a little Roman Catholicism over here, and then we have traditional religions. Those are religions that aren't part of the Big Six. If you watched that video on religion, you know what I'm talking about when I say the Big Six. The Big Six have to do with population. If you haven't watched that video on religion, please go watch it now. Okay, so I want us to understand a little bit about Buddhism, because Buddhism plays a big role in this region, just like Islam played a big role in Southwest Asia. Now, I've already made the comparison between Southwest Asia and Southeast Asia in that they're both shadow belts, meaning that people have wanted to control them for a very long period of time. And when we were in Southwest Asia, I said that the adoption of Islam was a result of a lot of things. The Arab conquerors used Islam as a way to create a homogenized culture. The tenets of Islam made sense in that region because, among other things, remember that's a region that people have tried to control. So I argued in class that adopting a religion that is so highly structured was a way to create a less vulnerable society. So if we have people who are part of a religion that has a lot of structure, right, that essentially we have submitted to Allah, and we go by the rules of Islam, which tells us to pray every day, which tells us to fast during Ramadan, which tells us to give alms. If you remember, I argued in class that that was a way of keeping society strong. If you have poor people in your society, if you have people who are suffering, then you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to people coming in and taking care of you. So you need to take care of the poor people in your society. If you remember, some of now this isn't one of the 5 pillars, but some of the things that are strongly supported, strongly, what's the word I'm looking for? Strongly, so you're not supposed to drink alcohol, is what I'm trying to say. It's not a tenet. It's not like it's not one of the 5 pillars, but they discourage, that was the word. They discourage the drinking of alcohol. And the reason they discourage the drinking of alcohol and gambling and all that kind of stuff is, once again, it weakens your society, right? It makes you more vulnerable. If you have people who are drunk, if you have people who are in debt, it just means that your society is more vulnerable to people attacking you. So if you remember, we talked about that when we were in Southwest Asia. And I'm going to argue that Buddhism is an equal and opposite reaction to the same issue, where people have tried to control Southeast Asia for a very long period of time, China for a very long period of time, the Mongolians, the Indus River Valley, the civilization of the Indus River Valley. Southwest Asia has tried to control Southeast Asia. Europeans have colonized Southeast Asia. It's an area that for a very long time people have tried to control because of it's a shadow belt and because of its resources, just like Africa. Okay, so Buddhism, I want to argue, is an equal but opposite reaction to that same need as a result of your society, your area, your location being a place that people want to control. I argue that Buddhism is a reaction to that. So let's look at Buddhism. So the story of Buddhism, if you don't know it, the Buddha was a man named Siddhartha. Oh, I should have worn my Siddhartha shirt today. So Siddhartha was, let's go to the map. Escape. Okay, so here we are in Asia, and Siddhartha was a person, he was a prince. He lived here so if you remember last week, I talked about Hinduism, and the hearth of Hinduism is the Indus River Valley over here. But the hearth of Buddhism is the Ganges. And so you have Siddhartha, who was a prince. He would have been Hindu. And if you remember from last week, Hinduism is a whole collection of, it's not really like one doctrine. There's not one book. It is a whole collection of different ideas and religions, and has more to do with like the inclusion of that area as a result of how the Indus River Valley, the civilization of the Indus River Valley colonized and took over South Asia. So he would have been Hindu. He was very, very wealthy. And he never left his castle. So he lived his entire life inside his castle. And inside his castle, he was married, he had a child, everything was extremely opulent. He was very, very wealthy. He had like an incredibly just cush life. And he never left the castle until he was 30. So when he was 30, he decided, I want to leave the castle walls. I want to go outside. I want to see my kingdom, right? And his dad was worried that he was going to see all these things that he hadn't seen in his life before. So his dad was worried that he was going to see poverty, that he was going to see old age, that he was going to see like unattractive people, that he was going to see deformed people, like all of that. And he wanted to shelter his son, even though his son was 30 and had a wife and child of his own and was going to take over this kingdom one day. He still had this idea that he had to be sheltered. So before Siddhartha goes out into his kingdom, what his dad does is his dad basically makes the outside of the castle look like the inside. So he goes outside the castle and he banishes anybody who's old, anybody who's sick, deformed. He like makes them all go away, and he fills the streets with just like beautiful party going people. It looks like Ibiza or something like that. And here comes Siddhartha, and he's being paraded around on a, what's it called, thing that people hold, a palanquin, or is that something from Star Wars? Let's say palanquin. He's being paraded around, and then he's like, wow, this is amazing, and people are like throwing streamers, I don't know, and they're all happy and they're all cheering for him, and he's like, this is fantastic, life is so wonderful. And then what happens is 2 old men had made their way through the crowd, and they're dressed in like loincloths, and they're skinny and they're old, and they like snuck in through the crowd so they could like catch a glimpse of Siddhartha. And Siddhartha sees them, and he's like, what the fuck is that, right? And he jumps off his palanquin and he chases these 2 old men, although they were pretty old, so I don't know if he was like chasing them, but he follows them, and he goes to the Ganges, and what does he see? He sees poverty, he sees sick people, he sees disfigured people, and he's like completely overwhelmed. Now think about the allegory of the cave. if you've ever read The Allegory of the Cave. The Allegory of the Cave is a story by Plato, and it is about these people who are locked in the bottom of a cave their entire life, and all they see are the reflections of what's happening outside the cave. So somebody has a fire outside the cave, and all they see are the reflections of people on the cave wall. And then one day, one of them gets taken out and shown real life. And his entire reality is based on the idea that reality is the reflection of people on this cave wall. And suddenly he sees that the life that he thought was reality is actually just a reflection of something else. So what does he do? He goes down to the bottom of the cave and he tries to tell everybody, like, hey, this is just a reflection. We should go out there. Like, there's all kinds of stuff happening out there. And the people kill him. That story, and also what's happening in The Matrix. You guys seen The Matrix? You should see The Matrix. It's on Netflix. And it's been like 25 years since it came out, so I'm sorry for this spoiler, but there's got to be a statute of limitations on spoilers. So at the end of The Matrix is this story that's based on the idea that our reality around us is actually all computer generated, and the real people in the world are all like locked into these little pods, and they're being used as fuel for the machines that actually control the world. And so the Neo, the main character, Keanu Reeves, at one point realizes, or like he's shown the truth, right? He's shown the truth by this guy named Morpheus, who's like, this is actually not reality. This is all just a reflection on the back of a wall. And so you can come and see reality, but it's not pretty. Or you can go back, and he gives him like the red or the blue pill choice. And he chooses to see reality and live in reality. And it's pretty gruesome. So both of those are stories that are similar to what happens with the Buddha, where the Buddha had this, and he wasn't the Buddha yet, he's Siddhartha, where Siddhartha had this life that was very, very different and wasn't actually reality. It was very different from the rest of the population of the world at the time. And then when he's faced with reality, he has a choice. Is he going to go back into the castle and forget what he saw? Is the guy who saw in the allegory of the cave, who sees reality in the fire, does he go back and just say like, no, I'm just going to stay here and watch the reflections on the wall for the rest of my life? Does Neo go back into the Matrix and just see the computer generated life that machines have created for them? In both those cases, and in all three of those cases, all parties decide to go out into the real world, and they're all met with different types of consequences. The guy in the bottom of the cave is killed. Neo becomes some amazing fighter in the Matrix, and Siddhartha becomes the Buddha. So how he becomes the Buddha is he spends the next 7 years living in dire poverty. He's living in extreme poverty. There's stories where like he ate like 1 grain of rice a month. I mean, obviously that's probably not true, but there's stories like that. He meditates. He spends all of this time trying to figure out, okay, what is this? Because remember, he was Hindu. So he had the idea of reincarnation. He had the idea of karma. He was basing his idea of like, okay, what is life all about on the tenets of Hinduism, on reincarnation and karma and everything like that. And he was trying to figure out, what is this all about? Because in Hinduism, like I said last week, there's not really an end to the cycle of life. The karmic cycle of life is a wheel, and it goes around and around and around, and we're stuck on it, right? We're stuck on a merry-go-round. And so what Siddhartha was trying to figure out is, what is this all about? Is there a meaning to this? Is there an end to this? And he meditates, and he tries to reach what we call enlightenment. So enlightenment is, again, back to the Matrix. The idea of enlightenment is, if you have seen it, and again, go watch it if you haven't seen it. At the end of the Matrix, they're always like going into the Matrix, and they have to fight these people called the agents. And the agents are like they're machines. So they're, like indestructible compared to humans. But in the end, Neo starts to see through the matrix. He can see all of the computer codes, and he fights the men, right? But he like, because he can see like through the puppet show, he really understands how to fight them. So in the end, he's fighting them, and he's just like so zen about it. And that's sort of what happens with Siddhartha, or that's at least what he's searching for. He's searching for that idea of enlightenment. There's this Zen proverb that I don't know if I've said it in class before, but the Zen proverb is chopping wood before enlightenment, chopping wood after enlightenment. And what is meant by that is once you reach enlightenment, once you can see through the puppet show, and that's what happens with Siddhartha. He reaches enlightenment. He can see through the puppet show at one point. And that's what happened with Neo in the Matrix. You still have to be part of this reality. So just because you know why things happen, just because you can see through the whole puppet show and understand why things happen, you still have to live inside this world. And so what Siddhartha starts to try to process is this it? Is it just this? Am I enlightened? Have I realized, okay, I can see through the puppet show, but I still have to get food. My body is still, subject to pain, to sickness, all of that stuff. And when he's trying to reach enlightenment, remember, he lived an opulent, wealthy life at one point, and then he lives this extreme life of poverty at another point. And he comes to the realization one day when he's meditating, he hears this teacher and a student, and the teacher is teaching the student, he has like a mandolin, and he says, if you pull the strings too tight, they're going to break. And if you have them too loose, you're not going to make any music. And so that's like his eureka moment, his moment of enlightenment, where he realizes, oh, that's the way. That's the way out of this kind of cycle of life, is when we live that middle path. And when we live that middle path, we can hopefully transgress and reach something called nirvana. So remember, I mentioned nirvana last week. In Hinduism, it doesn't exist in Hinduism, but I mentioned it kind of as a concept that goes along with, eventually it evolves from Hinduism. And that's the big part of Buddhism, is that through enlightenment and through the Eightfold Path, through basically following the middle path, we can end this cycle of constant suffering here on earth, and reincarnation and karmic retribution and reincarnation, and leave and reach nirvana. And so we're not really sure what nirvana is. Nirvana is the removal, though, of us from this earthly cycle of pain and karmic retribution. So those are the fundamental ideas of Buddhism. And so, like I said, it adheres to, it's from Hinduism, but it removes a lot of the harsher parts of Hinduism. It doesn't have the caste system, for one. Remember last week we talked about the caste system and how very harmful that can be to society. And two, there is an end. So in Hinduism, you have just this constant cycle. But in Buddhism, there's the possibility of transcending that cycle and reaching nirvana. And you do that, first you have to reach enlightenment. And so when the Buddha reaches enlightenment, that's actually when he becomes the Buddha. The Buddha means the enlightened one. So he's not the only Buddha. He's just the first Buddha, if that makes sense. Now, Buddhism also removes any gods. Hinduism has 3 million gods. Buddhism is an atheist religion. So it's an atheist religion. It doesn't have any gods. So you can have a religion that is atheist. And I hear a lot of people say, I'm atheist. Like, that means no religion. That just means no God. Okay, it focuses on knowledge, especially self-knowledge. We have to understand our desire for worldly goods, and we can't take anything from anybody. And if we can follow those 2 rules, where we want to understand why we desire, why we want things, why we want material goods, all of that kind of stuff, and as long as we don't take anything from anybody, we should be able to reach that enlightenment and eventually get to nirvana. That's the hope. Uh, Now, again, just with like with Hinduism, when I talked about not taking anything from anybody, that's very open to interpretation. Some people limit that to, stealing and murder. Other people would say taking from animals, because again, they have the same idea of reincarnation in Buddhism. So reincarnation would start with any living thing. So we're talking about um, bugs and animals and all of that are reincarnated. So you don't want to kill people or animals because one, it's taking a life and you're not supposed to take anything. And two, I mean, that's a pretty awkward conversation to have when you kill an animal and then it reincarnates and becomes a human, you know. So in Buddhism, we have the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths, and this is what Buddha comes up with when he hears that whole story of the mandolin player, and he's like, "Oh, this is how you reach enlightenment, is the middle path." So first, we want to accept that suffering exists and that every living thing suffers. So identifying that suffering exists. It's the first of the four noble truths. Second, you want to figure out what is the cause of suffering. Remember, I said a big part of Buddhism is self-knowledge. So what is the cause of your suffering? To end suffering is to reach nirvana. So now again, enlightenment and nirvana are two different stages. But if we want to end this suffering, this cycle of life, then we want to reach nirvana. And so how do I do this? I follow this eightfold path. And that is to have the right understanding of life, the right thought, the right speech, the right action, the right livelihood, the right effort, the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. And now you might think, well, what is the right concentration? What is the right effort? What is the right action? That's what you have to figure out. And in figuring that out, that's how you are supposed to leave this world and make it to nirvana. Okay, so I explained all of that. And I have Siddhartha here, that's the Buddha, the person who starts Buddhism and who is the original Buddha. And then I have this about Emperor Asoka. I want to make a point that religion starts and religion, there's a lot of different religions around the world. They've started all around the world. People continue to come up with religions today. And there's a difference between the religion and the spiritual process, and then when that religion becomes dominant in a culture. And that's a point I make more in my human geography class, but I hope that I made that point with Islam in Southwest Asia, that there was the religion, the tenets, and the idea of Islam. And then there was the absorption into society, and how a lot of people who became Islamic took old traditions, many of which Muhammad was trying to get away from, and just kind of like transferred them into Islam. Same thing that we saw with Christianity, right? Roman Catholicism in South America. When you have this new monotheist homogenizing culture come in, you still see little parts of the culture that existed before make its way through. Like with Roman Catholicism, we talked about the Sacred Heart and the focus on Mary, coming from matriarchal societies. We talked about, what happened when Christianity was introduced to the First Nations of Canada, what's now Canada, and the issues that people had with like the cutting down of trees. And we're going to see that again when we get to the Maori in New Zealand. So there is a difference between the religion at its heart, the person who started it, the generally the noble reasons that they started that religion, and then when it becomes a part of a culture. Now, I'm not saying that Emperor Asoka did anything wrong. I'm saying this is when Buddhism became part of its first culture. Christianity, for example, the first Christian country is Armenia, but Constantine is in what's now Turkey. Was the first Christian leader. His mom was Christian. He converted to Christianity, and he, as a result, like the entire Byzantine Empire, which would have been, Turkey, the Mediterranean coast, North Africa, becomes Christian. So there's a difference between like the soul, the heart of a religion, and then when that religion gets incorporated into culture. And I bring this up because that is something that we start to see in Burma, in Myanmar. And I had you guys watch that video from last week about the Rohingya in Burma and how they're being massacred, and they're an Islamic minority, and they're being massacred by Buddhists today. But remember, Buddhists are not supposed to kill anybody. They're not supposed to kill animals. They're not supposed to kill people. So you might question how would that come about? And that's what happens when a religion becomes manipulated by a culture. And it's no longer the heart of that religion. It's now used as kind of like a mass way to control people. And we've talked about that in class. One good example are merits. And I believe that merits were spoken about in Burma Chronicles, but that's something that you see also in Burma, Myanmar, which is the idea, okay, so in a religion like Buddhism, it's all about the self. There's no God. It's about self-knowledge, and it's about your own journey to reach enlightenment and to reach nirvana. So you would think that that's kind of an uncorruptible religion, but because what you do in this life, what you don't take in this life, your intentions in this life are supposed to affect your process into enlightenment and into nirvana. But this idea of merits is a good example of how culture interferes in a religion. And that is the idea that, okay, if I've done some bad things, which we all have, I can lighten my karmic load by donating money. If I donate, if I give food to monks, if I better yet build an entire pagoda, then my karmic debt has been lightened. You see the way that doesn't really match up with the original idea of the Buddha? So all of this I've discussed because I want you to understand how this would be an equal and opposite reaction in this region. So think about it. Because I went into Islam in Southwest Asia as a way for you to understand the culture of Southwest Asia, not just the religion, but also the reason that that religion made sense in that region. Well, it's the same thing here. Why would a religion that's based on self-knowledge work so well in a region that has been constantly colonized and taken over by people for thousands of years? And the basic reason, what I argue, is that in Buddhism, you have this acceptance that you cannot control the world around you. You can only control your reaction to it. So I can't control what's happening in the world. I can only control my reaction. And do you see how that can be a reaction to this constant conquering of this region? If I come to accept that I cannot control what is going to happen to my region, I can only control my reaction. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense, then you can email me, FaceTime me, Zoom. Okay, what time is it? Ooh, it's 12:39. I'm going to have to cut this lecture in two because I have to take my mom to the doctor. So I'm going to finish this lecture later tonight. This is population. This is population in different parts of Southeast Asia. As you can see, Indonesia has the lion's share of population. The Philippines has a good amount of population. Laos, Cambodia, not so much. And then all these little islands. Bali is part of Indonesia, though. I guess that's why it's green. Okay, so Angkor Wat is, there's a little video on Canvas about Angkor Wat, and it is a Buddhist and a Hindu temple, depending on where you are in time. It is as big as the city of Paris, if you can imagine. And so watch that video, and then I will come back and we'll talk about the economy of Southeast Asia and some environmental issues. All right.